One of the things Genshin Impact has always been commended for is its resistance, if not complete rejection, of the very idea of power creep. In fact, during Inazuma and Sumeru, characters like Yoimiya, Candace, and Cyno were even touted as something like reverse power creep, where characters not only didn't get stronger, they actually got weaker and more restrictive or niche. Well, any question of that continuing is out the window with Fontaine, with characters such as Lyney, Novelette, Farina, Navia, and now even characters like Chevreuse, not only being amazing and comparable, but often pushing the limits of what their element or their niche was meant to do. Let's talk about power creep. Welcome to Genshin Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. First of all, we obviously have to define power creep, because I think people often get lost in definitions and they're arguing with what they think is the person, but what they're actually arguing is just about the definition. And this happens in every debate, not just about power creep. But I think, at least for me, power creep is when a unit does something so much better than another that it feels like a substantial downgrade to play the other. And it's that way in virtually every scenario, so that there aren't really any pros to doing the other character or any meaningful pros for one character over the other. But this whole thing has to be coupled with the fact that it's a trend. It's a trend. Like, to say that Genshin has power creep, I have to see this over multiple characters, not just one character being strong. And I think right now we're right on the edge. Like, if we get one more character that's head and shoulders over and above what we're used to, then that's what I would personally consider drawing the line. But first, I want to rewind it all the way back to, I think, the very first instance of power creep, which was Kazuha. Kazuha powercrept both Sucrose and Venti, not right away, but through the fact that they changed the enemy properties and how enemies worked, how they weren't as vulnerable to Venti's suction. Kazuha just ends up being the superior choice almost all of the time to both of those characters when used practically. I think there's some scenarios where Sucrose can be better, but practically speaking, Kazuha is just better. Same with versus Venti. The next time we saw this was in Sumeru, where Nahida just blew every other Dendro unit out of the water, but that makes sense. She's the Archon, and all we had was Dendro Traveler and Kale and Tainari, who's a standard banner unit, so it makes sense that Nahida just blew them out of the water and essentially power creeped all the other Dendro units. Now, Alhaitham was the first instance of a potential power creep for the DPS role, because I don't think you have to necessarily be the same element as another unit to power creep them. I think you could argue that Alhaitham power crept other DPSs in that he was just the best DPS. Like, he's better at single target than Hu Tao at most levels investments on most team, better in AoE, better than Yoimiya. You could argue that Nilou power crept AoE DPS, although I think both of these have the same rebuttal, and that it's Nilou didn't power creep in single target, like, so she's not like head and shoulders above others, and really spread out AoE, who still want to group her. And similarly to Alhaitham, he's not so far ahead in single target DPS that it feels like true power creep, and he doesn't synergize with a grouper, so his AoE performance is always going to be limited. But I think he was the first character that could be considered power creep in terms of just being the best DPS. But when we got to Fontaine, Lyney was our first introduction, and he's just essentially a better Klee. Like, sure, his AoE performance might be slightly worse than Klee in some scenarios because of Kazuha and just how much AoE Klee's attacks have, but Lyney's burst damage and his ability to front load damage was really, really high. But, you know, just one character doesn't really tell us much. Novelette, I think, is the one that everyone looks at and considers to be true power creep. He's basically just better Ayato. And yeah, Ayato has some scenarios such as Nilou Bloom or Burgeon that he's better than Novelette, but even then it's even arguable that he's even the best in those scenarios, and really it's just showing that those aren't where Novelette shines best. Farina also a character that pretty much, she doesn't power creep any other units, I would say, because she just straight up created a new role, like buffer off-field damage dealer, but requires a healer. She basically combines two characters in one, but then requires you another character to add on. And if that character brings something meaningful, such as Viridescent Venerer, or if Cryo Application is valuable on that team, or if you want Dendro on that team, or if you want Bennett on that team, then you can generally get a ton of value out of Farina, and it's sort of just cheating. It's just too much power for one unit. You could call it power creep. But in all of these cases, and especially when you consider someone like Risley, the characters are not so much better than the other ones that it truly feels like power creep until you look at hyper investment, specifically maybe dolphin level investment or dedicated free-to-play level investment or just early vertical investment, because that is where the real power creep has come into Genshin. The amount that characters these days get out of their 5-star weapons or out of their early constellations is frankly absurd. The amount that you can push these characters to their limit with just a little bit more investment. I use air quotes because we're talking about a 5-star weapon or 1 or 2 constellations for a character. But the amount that you get out of that is supremely unbalanced with what anything we've been used to, except for Archon characters. Raiden C2 was considered the most highest value constellation at the time of release, and remained that way until probably Yelan C2, but was still one of the top until Nahida C2. But now with Fontaine, like, you could make some argument for Ayaka and her Mistsplitter, giving her extremely good value. But looking at Linny's constellations, especially his signature weapon, Wriothesley's constellation signature weapon, Furina's constellation too, especially, and as broken as Novelette is at C0, he gets the very biggest DPS increase from his signature weapon out of any character ever, over a 42% damage increase, and his Constellation 1 is a massive quality of life improvement plus a very large damage increase. When you have his C1, a C1R1 Novelette is just a different league of character. And I think that's one of the reasons why people consider Novelette to be so broken. Because people used to say, you know, getting Raiden C3 feels like you have a C6 character. Well, C1 R1 Novelette is practically the same damage increase, if not higher, than a C3 Raiden. And he starts from a higher baseline. Now, Raiden does have some value still, with more front load, whereas Novelette's a little bit more sustained damage, but Novelette's overall damage per rotation with C1R1 is just stupid. It's like a C6 character for C1R1. Furina is a very similar story with her C2. Navia might be the exception here. She's the only Fontaine character to not have a really crazy weapon or really crazy early constellations. So maybe this is just, you know, kind of coincidence that all these characters have had really powerful early constellations. So it's something that I kind of just want to keep my eye on. And I think this is relevant because as we get more and more and more and more and more characters, does anyone else feel like it's very hard to keep up? Like, even as a free-to-play, unless you're super new, the challenge isn't just getting your characters, it's being able to build them. It takes a lot of investment to build a character. And so if you're a free-to-play, or especially if you get the Welkin, your balance of characters you can get is starting to outbalance the amount of characters you can realistically build, or that you'd even realistically want to build. Of course, I found tons of value in building every single character, but I'm finding myself to have to do resin refreshes to catch up. I do not see a normal person being able to build all the characters they get, especially if you're just a Welkin player. It's starting to feel much more worth it to hone in and go for early constellations. Like Kazuha C2 used to be one of the best constellations, but it's completely a power-crept constellation compared to what we have with signature weapons and constellations from the new Fontaine characters. Like, if you start to get some constellations on your Novelette, your other just the C1R1, your other DPSs are gonna start to feel kind of bad. And this is where I think Hoyoverse really gets you. It's like, oh, you have this one character that's super, super, super strong, and they're so much better than your others. If you want your others to feel like them, now you have to get C2R1 for all your characters, or C1R1 for all your characters. Because it seems cheap for it just to be a weapon or just a constellation, but it's double what you would originally pay to get a character, if not triple. I think that Genshin started to notice that characters that were A, very strong at C0, and B, had strong early vertical investment performed better in terms of banner sales, a lot better than characters that didn't. So I personally expect this trend to continue. And I'd like to finish with, you know, is this a problem? Should this affect how free-to-plays, how low spenders, how players respond? Should this affect how you build up your account? And the first thing is, I don't think it's a bad thing yet. Or at least it's not a bad thing for everyone yet. Neuvillette, yes, he is the best character in the game, but I don't think, or the best DPS in the game, but I don't think he's so far above that other characters feel bad to play. I think Furina is the best character in the game, but I don't think she's so far above that, again, other characters feel bad to play. Like, not even close. And I don't think any of the characters are necessary for any of the content that we have. I think Genshin is trending in a really good way towards making the content more difficult to fight and to live. Like, you have to consider survivability on your teams, not just DPS, and you have to consider multi-wave versus single wave, bosses, AoE. There's a lot of different considerations, and it's not just about raw numbers. It's not just about, oh, my Neuvillette does more damage, so he always is just way better than all the other characters. There's other things to consider, which is again why I think that a character like Navia is really underrated, because she has so much front load. It's also why Linny is so good. And I think that a lot of characters such as Furina, they don't just power creep other characters, they bring up a whole new meta with them. They're not just sitting alone being broken. They bring up a character that previously would have been useless, like Charlotte, and make them OP. They make Dory serviceable to play. And Dendro made characters like Toma feel great to play. So there's very few characters, or the list, even though characters are coming out that kind of have a higher peak potential damage, old characters are not just being left in the dust. They're being corralled up. They're being brought up. Ning Wang is better than ever. Barbara even is better than ever, right? All these characters, Diluc, who knows, maybe he'll be the next character that we see a huge glow up for with a future synergy. Because as much as we have a trend of new characters feeling extra good, we also have a trend of them bringing up other less used characters. Even Chevreuse, she's a very strong character. I think she not only is strong in and of herself, but brings up other characters with her. As opposed to, for example, if they just made Wanderer like so broken, like if they made him just insanely broken, that wouldn't make any other characters better, because if his numbers were just better, then it would just feel really bad to play. Maybe that's not the greatest example, but should this change how you build out your account, what you're looking for? I think this just gives you another choice. I think with the new wave of characters, you can now choose, do you want to build for variety and vertically invest? Because if you want to 36 star the Abyss consistently, you either need to have a lot of different teams, or you can hyper invest into certain units and certain archetypes to make it so that they can always clear no problem. And the floor is still currently low enough that even a character like Raiden, who I still have a Constellation 0, I still haven't activated her C2, has no trouble clearing the Abyss, because I have full starring the Abyss, because I have gone to the trouble to vertically invest in her artifact. So now, if some people just hate artifact farming though, and for those people, you can invest into early constellations for Raiden, for Furina, for Neuvillette, so that you don't need as high of artifact investment to get those clears. Or if you're just more of a masher, or if you want to speed run while obviously being on a budget, or if you want more opportunities to see your characters do insane damage and absolutely obliterate the content instead of just full star it, you would just obliterate it. Characters are having more and more options for you to pick your endgame, for you to pick your playstyle. I think there's two great joys in the Genshin combat, and one of those is clearing the Abyss with your absolute favorite characters and crushing content with your favorites, and also experimenting and trying out new and different teams, because the different playstyles is really one of the things that keeps this game very fresh and fun. So I think you have to make sure to not get baited one way or the other. You have to know what you like. Do you like to build lots of characters and have fun trying them out and just replaying the Abyss for no reason like I do? Or do you have some favorite characters that you really, really love and that you want to hyper invest into so that you can obliterate the content? I think people who enjoy getting lots of teams will probably have more longevity in this game. Like, you'll enjoy playing the game for longer. If you just want to crush with your favorites, you'll probably eventually, like, what are you going to do once you get your C1R1 Neuvillette and you get your C2 Furina? What are you realistically going to do? Just keep crushing the content every time the Abyss comes out? Maybe that's fun. And for some people, that's the best way to play the game. And for other people, maybe you want to build a ton of characters to try out different things and test and have fun and with different teams and see how you like each team. And maybe you'll invest in just a couple favorites more heavily. That's kind of the route that I would go, is I plan to one day activate my C2 Raiden. I don't know when it'll be, but she'll sort of be an exception where everyone will be C0 and Raiden will be an exception. But some people just won't enjoy that. You don't enjoy the grind of continuously building characters because it can get pretty tiresome. Like, I'm working on my final few here and I'm working on getting them up, and it is a bit of a slog sometimes. So I think more than ever, like, I don't think that it's alarm bells. I don't think that Novelette is so strong that it's a problem. I don't think that Farina being so strong is a problem. I think that it is the best character balance time ever for Genshin, and if you're new, just make sure you get your very favorite characters at C0. I would work on getting their best teams with other 5 stars that are really important to them to make their good teams. And then from there, decide what kind of player you are. Are you a player that likes to hyper invest in your favorites, or to try out tons of new different characters? And I think both are totally valid ways of playing, and you can have fun either. Now, I do want to talk about the one area where this really could, in fact, be a real problem. And that's if they start to make really, really difficult abysses again. Because right now, and I don't think this is going to happen, by the way, but for a long time, ever since we had those really, really hard Sumeru abysses, I was a little bit concerned that you would start to need some vertical investment into your carries or into your characters, like not just having good artifact investment, but actually getting some constellations or some 5-star weapons, or just having really crazy cracked artifacts on your teams. There's a possibility that future abysses require either even higher levels of artifact investment, or they start considering that a lot of players will have C1R1 Novelette, that they will have a C2 Farina or a C2 Nahida or a C2 Raiden, or Nilu with her weapon, or Ayaka with her weapon, and a Shenhe and Shenhe's C1, or all the or a C2 Wanderer with Farazan. What if Abyss, instead of catering towards where it currently is, which is what I would consider very strongly the C0 meta, like C0 always feels good enough with 4-star weapons, except for it just towed the line towards the end of Sumeru where it started to put the squeeze on the horizontal investors such as myself. But since going back to Fontaine, we haven't had to worry about that. The difficulty has been way lowered. There's been a lot, and it's been a lot just a lot easier to meet those DPS checks or those elemental checks. The way that power creep could become an actual problem is if suddenly DPS Ayato starts to feel like it's really not enough, even if you're really well invested, and you're actually feeling that you should have got Novelette, and just picking your favorite didn't feel as good. This, I would think, would be a real problem for the community. And again, I don't think this is going to happen, but I do think it's something to keep in the back of your mind maybe. I think for people who want to be resistant to power creep, just make sure you get the very top units. There's like 6 units that I put in S tier that I would consider the very, very top. And if you have those units, you always have the option of vertically investing into one or more of them in the future. If you get a C2 Farina, a C2 Nahida, you're never going to struggle with the Abyss again. That's just how it's going to be. If you want to know what those top 6 units are, check out my ultimate tier list video. I put a ton of work into it, and it's really, really good. Give it a watch. Take care. Bye for now.